6 centuries of ancient magic have never once been wrong. It reads the rooms of a soul we've never dared to light, and returns the one name we swore could never be ours. Some truths cannot be proved, only survived. We begin our story now. The working did not announce itself the way ordinary magic did. There was no flair, no obliging shimmer of light for the benefit of onlookers. When the Bureau's oldest charms settled on an answer, it simply grew quiet, the way a room goes quiet when someone has stopped breathing to listen. And then the parchment warmed under the palm. Hermione had felt that warmth 1,000 times. She had laid her hand over other people's results for 6 years, watched relief bloom across strangers' faces, watched them press the still warm sheet to their chests as though a name could be an embrace. She had learned to read the small betrayals people made when the magic told them the truth. The sudden interest in a shoe buckle, the throat cleared one time too many, the way a woman would reach up and adjust a curl that had not moved. She had never once laid her hand on her own. It was against no rule. It was simply the sort of thing one did not do, the way a healer does not diagnose herself, the way a cartographer does not trust the map of the room she is already standing in. But the office was empty tonight, the last clerk gone home, the sconces burning low and blue along the corridor of the compatibility division, and the loneliness had come for her again. That particular ache that arrived on Sunday evenings and sat with her like an unwelcome guest, patient, in no hurry to leave. So she had done it. Half a dare, half a wound she was pressing to see if it still hurt. She had filled the basin with the reading ink, spoken the old words, laid the fresh parchment flat, and set her hand upon it. Not a questionnaire, never that. The Bureau did not ask you what you wanted. It read what you were and would not tell you the difference. It reached past the parts of a person they had rehearsed and polished for company, down into the rooms of the self that had never been opened, and it found the shape that those unlit rooms would answer to. It found the person whose absence the soul had already been grieving without knowing it. The parchment warmed. Hermione closed her eyes and let herself want it, just for a breath. Let herself imagine the name that would rise, someone kind and clever and steady, someone whose edges fit the ragged places the war had left in her. She had earned that much. She had put herself last for a decade. Just this once, she let the wanting in. Then she looked. Draco Lucius Malfoy. The ink had not run. The letters sat there in the copper plate the charm always used, unhurried, certain, as though they had waited years for her to finally read them. She stared at the name until the letters stopped being letters and became only marks. And then she made them be letters again, and it still said the same thing. A sound came out of her, not quite a laugh. The kind of noise a person makes when the floor they trusted turns out to be painted onto air. "No," she said to the empty room. Her voice was very reasonable. "That's a fault." She said it again, and the second time it steadied her, because of course it was a fault. She dealt in faults. She was the one they brought the faults to. A crossed sigil in the basin, an impurity in the ink, a resonance bleeding through from an adjacent working. The causes were mundane and numerous, and every one of them was fixable. That was the whole of her comfort in this life. that things which went wrong had reasons, and reasons could be found, and found things could be mended. She scraped the basin clean with a hand that she noticed, with cold detachment, was not entirely steady, and she reached up and tucked back a curl that had not fallen, and she stopped, appalled at herself, her fingers frozen in her own hair. That is what they do, she thought. The strangers, when the magic tells them a thing, they are not ready to be told. She lowered her hand very slowly. Then she rolled up her sleeves, past the pale seam of scar tissue on the left forearm that she never looked at directly, and she got to work. She was still there when the windows went from black to the bruised grey of almost morning. She had run the working 4 times. She had changed the ink. She had reinscribed the basin sigils from the master text, checking each stroke against the diagram with a jeweler's glass. She had swept the room for adjacent resonance and found none, had cast for tampering and found none, had, in a low moment near 3 in the morning, even wondered whether someone had hexed the whole apparatus as a joke, and found that too to be nothing. 4 times. 4 times the parchment warmed under her hand with that terrible patience, and 4 times the copperplate wrote out the same 3 words, and by the 4th she was no longer surprised, and that was the thing that frightened her. Not the answer, but that she had begun to expect it. She sat back. The chair creaked. Somewhere below, in the belly of the building, the night clerks were shifting the great ledgers, and the sound came up through the stone like the breathing of something asleep. The magic was not wrong. That was the founding truth of the Bureau, older than the ministry that housed it, older than the war, older than her opinions of herself or of anyone. In 6 centuries of records, there was not one confirmed false match. Not one. She had told people that gently when they came to her white-faced and furious with a result they hated. The charm does not read who you have decided to be, she would say. It reads who you are. Sometimes those are the same person. Sometimes it takes a while to introduce them. She had believed it when it was someone else's life. Now the same sentence sat in her mouth like a stone she could not swallow. Because she knew herself. She was the most examined person she had ever met. She had turned herself over and inspected every seam. She knew her values, her convictions, the exact contour of her history. And her history had Draco Malfoy in it as a cruelty, a sneer, a slur pronounced with the fluency of long practice, a boy who had watched from a doorway while... No, she would not go there. The point stood. The point was that she of all people had no unlit rooms. She had a torch in every one. And still the parchment had warmed. There was, she realized, only one way to prove the fault. Not from her side of the working, from his. The thought arrived so cleanly and so appallingly that she stood up without meaning to. If the charm had returned him to her, then the charm, if it were functioning, would have returned her to him. Compatibility was mutual. The old magic did not deal in one-sided things. Every match the Bureau made ran both ways, always. It was the first principle. So somewhere in the returned results ledger, filed and sealed under his name, there would be a reading. And if that reading said something other than Hermione Granger, anyone else, any other name at all, then she would have her proof. A break in the symmetry, a fault located and confirmed, and she could file it and correct it and go home and never lay her hand to that parchment again. She was down the spiral stair before she had finished the thought, her footsteps striking hollow off the cold stone of the vacant corridor, the sound chasing her the whole way down. The returned results vault smelled of the tooth of old parchment and the dry mineral cold of stone that never saw the sun. She lit the sconces with a flick and did not wait for them to steady before she was moving along the shelves, reading the alphabetized spines, L, M, Ma. The Malfoy file was thin. Most were. She almost couldn't do it. Her hand hovered at the seal, and for one long moment the whole of her good sense stood up in her and told her to stop, to leave it be, to file her own anomaly through the proper channels, and let some other clerk, some stranger, handle the indignity of it. There was still time to be a person who had not looked. Then she broke the seal, because she was not, and never had been, a person who did not look. One sheet, dated 7 weeks ago. He had come in. She found the intake note in the margin, the receiving clerk's cramped hand. Client requested standard reading, declined counsel, declined to receive result in person, requested sealed delivery by owl, declined to receive it in person. Of course he had. She could see him doing it, that cold, closed face, refusing the small human moment the Bureau tried to give everyone. And there, in the copper plate that did not run and did not lie and had not been wrong in 600 years, was the answer the magic had given him. Hermione Granger. The sconces hissed. The cold came up through the soles of her shoes. 7 weeks. He had known for 7 weeks. He had opened this by owl alone, wherever he lived his closed grey life, and he had read her name, and he had said nothing. Not a letter, not a word, not a single attempt to contest it or query it or laugh at it, or do any of the 100 things she was doing right now in a fever at 5 in the morning. He had held this for 7 weeks in complete silence and let her walk into it blind. Her fingers tightened on the sheet until the old parchment gave a thin, protesting creak, and she made herself ease her grip before it tore, and she stood very still in the cold vault with both their names in her hands, and understood that whatever this was, it was no longer something she could file and forget. She was going to have to look him in the face. She did not sleep. There was a bed in the small flat in Islington, and she lay in it for the shape of an hour with her eyes open to the ceiling, watching the grey light strengthen and the crack in the plaster resolve itself into the same crack it had been yesterday, when the world had been an ordinary place with ordinary rules. She had left both sheets in the vault. She had resealed the Malfoy file with her own hand, badly, the wax setting crooked, and she had gone home the Muggle way, walking because she did not trust herself to apparate with her mind in the state it was in, likely to leave a leg behind in a corridor and the rest of her scattered across 3 counties. 7 weeks. The number would not leave her alone. She turned it over the way she had turned the parchment over, looking for the seam, the flaw, the place where it stopped making sense. 7 weeks was not a shock and a silence. 7 weeks was a decision. 7 weeks was a man receiving a piece of information and choosing deliberately every morning for 49 mornings to do nothing with it, to let it sit sealed in a ministry vault with her name inside it, while she went about her small life, not knowing she had been filed away as belonging to him. The word landed wrong in her chest, belonging. And she got up, because lying still with a word like that in her was intolerable. By 8:30, she had a plan, and a plan was a place to stand. The plan was simple, and it was clean, and it had the great virtue of returning her to the ground she trusted, which was the ground of procedure. She would not go to him in a fever. She would not go to him at all as a woman with a name in her hands. She would go to him as an officer of the Bureau conducting a variance investigation, because that was, she reminded herself with something like relief, exactly what this was: a variance, an anomaly requiring documentation. There were forms for it. There was a protocol, dusty and almost never invoked, for the re-examination of a contested result. And the protocol required, she had read it twice over her cold tea to be sure, the physical presence of both parties for a supervised rerun of the working. Both parties present in a room. It was, she told herself, unfortunate but necessary. It was the only rigorous way. If the fault was in the apparatus, a supervised rerun would expose it. If the fault was in the ink or the sigils, she had already ruled those out, but a witnessed procedure would make the ruling official. And if? She made herself hold the thought steadily, the way she made herself hold a wand steady over a difficult working. If the rerun returned him a 5th time, and her a 2nd, then she would have documented, witnessed, procedurally unimpeachable proof that the Bureau had produced its first false match in 6 centuries, and she would take that proof up the chain and let the whole edifice of ancient certainty answer for it. That was the plan. Procedure, distance, forms in triplicate. She wrote the summons herself in her flattest official hand, and did not read it back for fear of hearing how it sounded. The Bureau of Marriage Charms requires your attendance for a supervised variance procedure regarding result reference M-4471. Attendance is not optional under statute. You will present yourself at the times indicated. She did not sign it Hermione. She signed it H.J. Granger, Senior Charmwright, Compatibility Division, and she sealed it and gave it to the Bureau owl and watched the bird lift away over the wet slate roofs. And only when it was too small to recall did she let herself feel how hard her heart was going. He came on the 3rd day, which was the last of the 3 she had named, and she understood as the door opened that the delay had been its own kind of message. He had made her wait the maximum the summons allowed. He had read attendance is not optional and answered it with the smallest legal insolence available to him, and something in her, some low, disgraceful, competitive thing, respected it even as it set her teeth. Then he was in the doorway of the procedure room, and every clever thing she had rehearsed went out of her like breath. He was thinner than the boy in her memory, and the thinness had refined him rather than diminished him. The softness of the schoolboy face burned off, leaving the architecture underneath. He wore grey, good grey, the tailoring severe and unshowy, a man who had learned to stop announcing his money. There was a silver ring on his right hand, a signet, and she watched the way the winter light off the window caught the flat of it as he pulled the door to behind him. His hair was shorter, his face was closed, and his eyes came to her across the room and did not sneer, did not sharpen, did nothing she had armoured herself against. They only rested on her, grey and unreadable and steady, and then dropped once to the sealed folder on the table between them and came back to her face. He knew she knew. She saw him understand it in the space of a breath, that the summons was no accident, that reference M-4471 was not some stranger's problem she had been assigned, that she had looked in the vault, that both their names were now in the room. Granger, he said. One word. Level. No barb in it. She had not heard his voice in years, and it was lower than she remembered, and it did something to the air of the room that she refused to examine. Malfoy. She was pleased with her own voice. It came out cool and correct, the voice of a woman with forms. Sit, please. This is a supervised procedure. There will be a witness. Where is the witness? Detained. She'll be here. This was a lie. There was no witness. She had told no one, could not bear to tell anyone, and the protocol's requirement of a witness was, she had discovered with a small hot flush of shame, the one part of the procedure she was quietly breaking. She had told herself she would document everything in writing instead. She had told herself a great many things. He looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable, and she had the unpleasant sensation of being read, not by the charm, by him. And then he pulled out the chair and sat, unhurried, and set both hands flat on the table, the signet clicking once against the wood, and waited. She explained the procedure. She was good at explaining procedures. It was the one register in which she could always find her feet. He would place his hand on the fresh parchment. The working would read him. The result would be witnessed and recorded. Then she would run the reciprocal on herself, and the two would be compared for symmetry, and any break in the symmetry would constitute documentable evidence of apparatus failure. She kept her eyes on the basin as she spoke, on the ink, on her own hands, on anything but him. "You've already done this," he said when she'd finished. Not a question. "That's not relevant to 4 times, I'd guess." His voice was very quiet. "You'd have run it 4 times before you went to the vault. Maybe 5. You wouldn't have gone looking for my file until you'd exhausted your own end of it. That's how you work." Her head came up. He was watching her with an attention she found she could not hold and could not look away from. And the worst of it was that he was right. Exactly right. Right down to the number. And she had no idea how a man who had not spoken to her in years could know how she worked with such offensive precision. "You don't know how I work," she said. "No," he agreed, and looked away first, down at his own flat hands on the table. And there was something in the giving up of the argument that was more disarming than any argument would have been. "No, I suppose I don't." The silence after that was a physical thing. It had weight. It pressed on the small cold room the way the pressure drops before weather turns, and the sconces guttered, and somewhere far off in the building a bell marked the hour, and neither of them moved to fill it. She broke it because she could not stand it. "You had the result 7 weeks ago." It came out before she had decided to say it, and it came out wrong, not procedural at all, bare. "You knew, and you said nothing." His hands did not move, but his knuckles, she saw, the long pale fingers spread flat on the wood, went slowly white at the joints, the only motion in him, a pressure travelling down through his hands into the table as though he were bracing against something that wanted to move him. He did not look up. "What would you have had me say?" he said. Not a question either. His voice had gone somewhere very controlled, the control audible, the control costing him. "Granger, what, precisely? Should I have written to you? Dear Miss Granger, I regret to inform you that 6 centuries of infallible magic believe we are each other's—" He stopped. He did not finish it. She watched him choose not to finish it, watched the word arrive at the gate of his mouth and be turned back, and the not finishing was louder than the sentence would have been. "So, you said nothing," she said. "So, I said nothing." He unfolded his hands from the table at last, slowly, and sat back, and the winter light moved on the signet ring, and when he looked at her again, the closed grey face had closed a fraction further, a door easing shut in a cold house. "I assumed the same thing you assumed, that it was a fault. I assumed you'd never look at your own, because why would you? And if you never looked, you'd never know, and it would sit in a vault forever bothering no one but me." That seemed the smallest pause, the kindest available arrangement. The kindest available arrangement. She turned the phrase over and could find no cruelty in it, no angle, no trap, and its plainness undid something in her defences that she badly needed to keep intact. "Well," she said, and heard her own voice not quite steady, and hated it, and reached up and adjusted the cuff of her sleeve, which was already perfectly straight, tugging it down over the scar she did not look at, tugging it a second time when the first had already done the work. "It's being looked at now. So, your hand, please, on the parchment." He looked at the fresh sheet lying pale on the dark table between them. He looked at it for a long moment, and she understood that for him this was not procedure, that for him laying his hand down was laying something else down, and that he had come here across 3 days of deliberate delay, knowing he would have to do it in front of her. Then he leaned forward, and the sleeve of the good grey coat pulled back an inch as he reached, and she saw, on the inside of his left forearm, the faded but unmistakable grey of the thing burned there years ago, the mark he would carry to his grave, and he saw her see it, and neither of them said a word, and his hand came down flat upon the parchment as the sconces flared, and the room went suddenly and completely still. The parchment warmed. She had felt that warmth 100 times from the observer's side of the table, watching a stranger's face. For the moment the magic settled, and she had thought herself immune to the small theatre of it. She was not immune now. Now she watched his hand, the long pale fingers spread flat, the signet catching the light, the faint grey shadow of the mark just visible at the retreating cuff. And she watched the warmth reach him, watched the almost imperceptible change come over him as the old working reached past everything he had built to keep people out and touched whatever it was that lived underneath. He did not flinch. She had expected him to flinch. Most people did. A tightening, a catch of breath, the body's honest surprise at being read so far down. He only closed his eyes and let it happen, and the stillness of him as he let it happen was somehow worse than any flinch would have been, because it told her he had done this before, had sat with this same charm reading the same buried thing, and had learned to hold himself open to it without struggle. 7 weeks ago. Sealed delivery by owl. He had let it read him once already, and he had let it read him alone. The copper plate wrote itself across the sheet in the unhurried hand the charm always used, and she did not need to lean forward to see it, because she already knew, had known since the vault, had known perhaps since the first warm sheet 3 nights ago, and the knowing did nothing to soften the sight of her own name appearing letter by letter under his motionless hand. Hermione Granger. He opened his eyes. He read it. His face did not change, and the not changing was its own confession. A man does not need to compose a face that is already composed. A man composes a face against something. She watched him hold himself level over her name and understood that the levelness was work, was effort, was a wall built brick by brick in the space of a breath. "There," he said, quietly. He drew his hand back off the parchment and folded it with the other in his lap, out of sight, out of the light. "Symmetry. Both ways. Your fault, if it is one, is a very thorough fault." "It re-ran," she said. Her voice came out too fast. "That's not the same as the original. It could be the working, repeating a corrupted result, carrying the error forward. A resonance from the first reading imprinting on the Granger apparatus, which would produce exactly this kind of false symmetry, a self-confirming loop, which is precisely why the reciprocal test is insufficient on its own, and why I'll need to Granger." Not loud, but it stopped her, because there was no cruelty in it, only a kind of tiredness. And she was not armoured against his tiredness the way she was armoured against his contempt. He looked at her across the small, cold room, and the winter light lay grey along the side of his face. "You're going to run this until it gives you the answer you came in with. You know that. I know that. We can both save a great deal of time if you'll simply admit that no single result is ever going to be enough, because the problem was never the result." Her mouth was open to argue, and nothing came out of it. "The problem," he said, and here his voice dropped lower still, gentled in a way she would not have believed him capable of, "is that a piece of magic you have trusted, your whole career has told you a thing about yourself that you have decided cannot be true. And you would rather dismantle 600 years of infallible working, brick by brick, alone, at 5 in the morning, than sit with the possibility that it knows something you don't." The silence after that had a flaw to it, a bottom, the way a well has a bottom you cannot see but can feel by the change in the air. She sat in it. She reached up and adjusted her cuff and stopped herself halfway, appalled, and put her hand back in her lap and gripped one hand with the other until it hurt. "You don't get to do that," she said, and her voice was low, and it shook, and she let it shake, because holding it steady had become more than she could manage. "You don't get to sit there and read me. That's the machine's job, not yours. You don't know me. You knew a girl you called things I won't repeat in a corridor 20 years ago, and you have no right to—" "You're right." He said it instantly, flatly, without defense, the way he had said no, "I suppose I don't on the first day," and it took the ground out from under her rising anger and left her standing on nothing. "I don't know you. I knew that girl, and I was, to that girl, the very worst version of myself, and I have thought about it more than you would ever believe, and none of that is repairable by anything I can say in this room." His jaw worked once. his hands in his lap out of the light. She could not see them, but she saw the tension of the arms that led down to them, the cords standing in his wrists. So no, I won't pretend to know you. I'll only say that I recognize the thing you're doing, because it is the same thing I did for 7 weeks, and I have some small authority on the subject of refusing to look at a result. She had not expected that. She had come armed for scorn, for the old fluency of his cruelty, and instead he kept setting down his weapons in front of her, one after another, disarming himself in a way she had no defense prepared for. It was, she thought wildly, a kind of unfair, that a man could make himself so undefended that her own defenses began to look like the aggression in the room. "I'm not refusing to look," she said. "I'm being rigorous." "They can be the same thing," he said. "In a sufficiently frightened person, I would know." She did not run it again that day. She told herself it was because the apparatus needed to rest between readings. Which was true. The old workings did draw on the ambient magic of the room and needed hours to replenish. But it was not the whole truth, and she was too tired to lie to herself convincingly. And the whole truth was that she could not sit across from him and lay her own hand on the parchment while he watched. Not today. Not with her name still warm in the copper plate under his motionless fingers. So she reached, instead, for the other half of the protocol, the part she had been dreading more than the readings themselves, the part that required her to do the very thing the charm did, only badly, by hand, in words. "The variance procedure," she said, gathering the shreds of her official voice, "requires a documented interview. If I'm to demonstrate incompatibility, I have to record the relevant interior particulars, values, history, the things the working reads. I compile them, I demonstrate the mismatch on paper, and that goes in the file alongside the anomalous result. It's evidence." He raised one pale brow. "You want to interview me about my interior. I want to document why the two of us are self-evidently incompatible, so that when I take this upstairs, the incompatibility is a matter of record and not of my personal assertion." She met his eyes and made herself hold them. "So, yes, I need to know what you value, what you fear, what you've become. I need it in your own words, and I need it to be honest, because a lie won't demonstrate anything except that you're capable of lying, which I already know." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile, but the ghost of where a smile would live in a warmer man. "You want honesty from a Malfoy, for your records." "I want it because you keep giving it to me," she said, before she could weigh whether to. "And I don't understand why. And it's the single most disorientating thing that has happened to me in a week that has been almost nothing but disorientation. So please, just answer the questions. Let's get it on paper and be done." He was quiet for a moment. The light had begun to go from the window. The short winter afternoon was folding itself away, and the shadows in the corners of the procedure room deepened and pooled, and neither of them lit the sconces higher, as though the growing dimness were a mercy they were each too proud to refuse. "Ask, then," he said. She took up her quill. She had a list. She had written it the night before, cold professional questions, the kind she used on strangers. "What do you consider the central value by which you order your life?" She meant to start there, safely, at the surface. But what came out of her in the dim and the quiet, with his grey eyes on her across the narrow table, was not on the list at all. Why did you let it read you alone? He went still. She had not meant to ask it. It was not procedural. It was not evidence. It was the question that had sat in her chest since the vault, the human question underneath all the rigorous ones, and it had climbed out of her before her discipline could catch it. For a long moment, she thought he would not answer, that she had reached too far, and he would close the door she had been prizing open all afternoon. His gaze dropped to the table, to the pale rectangle of parchment still lying there, with her name written on it in the charm's patient hand, and one finger came up and touched the edge of the sheet, just touched it, the signet ring clicking soft against the wood. "Because I didn't want anyone to see my face when I read it," he said. His voice had gone very low, almost to nothing, pitched for the failing light. "In case it was you. In case it was you, and I couldn't arrange myself in time." He looked up, and for the first time all afternoon, the closed grey face was not entirely closed. There was something behind it, held down hard but visible, the way a light is visible behind a shuttered window. "I have spent a long time learning to keep my face from telling the truth, Granger. It's the one useful thing my father ever taught me, and I did not trust it to hold if the name was yours. So I read it where no one could see." The quill was motionless in her hand. She had come to gather evidence of how little she could ever have in common with this man. And she had, in the space of a single unguarded question, been handed a thing so intimate she did not know where in her rigorous file it could possibly go. And she sat in the deepening dark with her name lying warm between them, and understood, with a cold, clean drop of certainty in her chest, that she was no longer entirely sure what she was trying to prove. The interviews continued because the protocol demanded them, and because, though she would not have said this aloud, would scarcely say it to herself, she had begun to arrange her days around the fact of them. She told herself it was thoroughness. She was building a case, and a case was built the way she built everything, exhaustively from every angle, leaving no seam unexamined. So she scheduled him again and again, always under the cover of documentation, always with her quill and her list of cold professional questions that she never quite managed to keep to. And each time the winter afternoons folded shorter around them, and the procedure room filled earlier with that pooling dark. And each time she learned another thing about him that she could not fit anywhere in the file marked incompatible. She learned that he had not lived at the manor in 6 years. That he could not, he said, and did not explain further. And she did not ask, because she had walked past that house once in the paper's photographs after the trials, and she did not need it explained. She learned that he worked, actually worked with his hands, which she had not imagined a Malfoy doing, restoring damaged magical texts, the kind of slow, painstaking conservation that required a person to sit for 8 hours over a single scorched page, coaxing the ink back to legibility. She learned this last thing, not because he told her, but because he mentioned in passing the exact smell she had used in her own private thoughts, without ever saying it to a soul. The tooth of old parchment, he called it, that dry particular scent of vellum aged past a century. And she had looked up so sharply from her quill that he had stopped and asked what. "Nothing," she had said. That's how I think of it. That smell, the tooth of it." He had held her eyes for a moment across the narrow table. "Yes," he had said, "that's the only way to say it." And she had written nothing down, because there was no column in her documentation, for we describe the smell of old books with the same 3 words, and she had felt the absence of that column as a kind of vertigo, a step taken onto a stair that was not there. By the 5th interview, she could no longer pretend the interviews were sufficient. She needed precedent. If she was to prove the Bureau had produced a false match, she could not merely assert that this match felt false to her. That was worth nothing, less than nothing, the special pleading of a frightened woman, exactly the thing he had accused her of. She needed to find another false match in the record. 1. A single documented instance in 600 years of the working returning 2 people who were genuinely, provably, permanently wrong for one another. If such a case existed, it would establish that the charm could err, and if it could err once, it could err twice, and her own anomaly would have a place to stand. The precedent, if it existed, would be in the deep archive. The deep archive was not the returned results vault. The vault held the living files, the last few decades. The deep archive held everything else. 6 centuries of marriage charm records, every reading the Bureau had ever made, bound in ledgers the size of paving stones, and shelved in a chamber that ran back under the building further than the sconces could show. Almost no one went down there. The magic that preserved the oldest ledgers was delicate and cold-hungry. It kept the air at a temperature that leached the warmth out of a person within the hour, and it did not permit the ordinary heating charms, so that anyone who worked there for any length of time did so in gloves and a heavy coat by the light of candles that the preservation magic tolerated where it would not tolerate a wand-lit flame. She could not do it alone. That was the plain fact of it, and it galled her. The ledgers were too many, and the cross-referencing too vast. To search 6 centuries for a single overturned match in any reasonable span of nights, she needed a second reader. And the only other person alive who currently had standing to be in a sealed variance procedure, who had signed the confidentiality binding, who already knew every shameful particular of reference, M-4471. "You want me to help you prove we don't belong together," Draco said when she put it to him. They were in the procedure room. It was the 6th interview, or it had been meant to be, before she had set down her quill and made the request. "In the archive, for however many nights it takes, alone. There's no one else I can ask." It came out more honest than she intended. "I can't bring in another clerk. If I do, this stops being a quiet variance investigation and becomes a scandal. It becomes the story of how the Granger woman got matched to Draco Malfoy and couldn't accept it. And it will be in the papers within the week. And it will be about you as much as about me. And I don't..." She stopped. She had not meant to say the last part, the part where she did not want the papers to have him. "I can't ask anyone else," she finished. He was quiet. The signet turned once on his finger, a small habitual motion she had come to know. "So, the 2 people trying to disprove a match," he said slowly, "will do it by shutting themselves in a freezing archive together, night after night, by candlelight." "When you say it like that," she said, "it It sounds absurd. It is absurd, Granger. And then, unexpectedly, the ghost of a smile actually arrived, faint and reluctant, and gone almost at once, the first she had seen reach all the way to his eyes. It's the most absurd thing I've heard in years. I'll come Thursday. The archive was worse than she had prepared for, and the candlelight was better. Worse, because the cold was not the crisp, clean cold of the vault, but something older and more patient. A cold that had had 6 centuries to settle into the stone and did not intend to be disturbed by anything as brief as a human body. It came up through the soles of her boots and down from the low vaulted ceiling and met in the middle of her, and no coat entirely answered it. Better, because the candles the preservation magic permitted were beeswax, dozens of them in old iron stands, and their light was nothing like the flat blue burn of the bureau's sconces. It was warm and gold and living. It moved. It made the great dark ledgers throw shadows that leaned and swayed. It laid a low amber glow along the planes of his face, across the reading table that made him look like something out of an older portrait than any that hung in the manor. They worked. That was the mercy of it, and also the danger, that there was real work to do, and doing it side by side dissolved the guardedness that a bare table between 2 chairs enforced. They divided the centuries. He took the older ledgers, the medieval hands he could read where she struggled, the Latin abbreviations and the crabbed conservator's notes that were, she realized, exactly the sort of text he spent his working days restoring. She took the modern. They passed the great books between them, and their gloved hands met at the spines, and once his bare fingers brushed hers where a glove had worn thin at the seam, and the cold of the room made the brief warmth of the contact shocking, a small static shock of skin, and they both drew back too fast and said nothing, and bent again to the ledgers. Hours went by. The candles burned down and were replaced. They found matches, thousands of them, tens of thousands, 6 centuries of names paired to names in the patient copperplate, and not one of them overturned. Not one queried, not one contested, not one marked in any conservator's hand as false. The record was exactly as immaculate as she had always told the frightened strangers it was, and every immaculate page was a page that took something from her, a small subtraction, a brick eased out of the wall she was trying so hard to hold up. Near 2 in the morning, she found her hands too cold to turn the leaves, and she flexed them, wincing, and he saw, and without a word, he set down his own book and reached across and took her hands in both of his and pressed them between his palms. She should have pulled away. She did not pull away. His hands were cold too. Everyone's were down here. But there were more of them than of hers, and he chafed her fingers slowly between his own, his head bent, his face unreadable in the amber light, and neither of them spoke, and the great ledgers stood in their ranks all around them in the dark like a congregation, and the only sound was the small hiss of the candles and the almost silence of 2 people breathing in a cold room. And she looked at the pale crown of his bent head and the careful, impersonal, entirely deliberate motion of his hands warming hers, and understood that she had stopped some time ago, some hours or some nights ago, being able to feel the edges of the thing she had come here to prove. "There's no false match," she said. Her voice came out barely above the candles. "Is there? in 600 years. He did not stop the slow motion of his hands. He did not look up. "No," he said. "I don't think there is." "Then what am I doing down here?" "I've wondered that," he said, very low, still bent over her hands, still warming them. "Every night this week." And he lifted his head at last, and the candlelight moved on his face and caught the grey of his eyes and held there. And he was closer than she had realized, close enough that she could see the exhaustion under his composure, and the thing beneath the exhaustion that he had spent a lifetime learning to keep his face from showing, and was not quite, in this cold amber-lit hour, managing to keep from showing now. And her breath went shallow, and her cold hands went still between his warm ones, and neither of them moved, and the small space of freezing air that remained between them thinned to almost nothing as the nearest candle guttered low and threw its last leaning shadow across the two of them, frozen at the edge of a thing that a single further inch would make impossible to ever again call an error. She was the one who pulled back. She did it because the alternative was to close that final inch, and to close it would be to concede everything, the whole architecture of certainty she had come into that cold chamber to defend. And she was not ready, was nowhere near ready, and so she drew her hands out from between his and stood too fast and knocked her chair, and the sound of it barked off the stone and startled the candle shadows into leaping. And she said something about the hour and the cold, and needing to get the ledgers back into their preservation fields before the warmth of their hands did any damage. And none of it was quite coherent, and he let her have it. He did not reach for her again. He watched her gather herself with that grey, unreadable steadiness, and he helped her reshelve the great books in silence. And when they parted at the top of the archive stair, he only said, "Good night, Granger," in a voice that gave nothing away, and was gone. She did not sleep again. She was building a tally of the nights she did not sleep, and it was becoming a career. Lying in the Islington dark with the crack in the plaster overhead, she made herself do the thing she was best at, the thing that had always saved her, which was to reason. She laid the evidence out in her mind the way she would lay it in a file. She had run her own reading 5 times, him every time. She had witnessed his reading, her, once, under supervision. She had searched 600 years of immaculate record for a single false match, and found none. Every rigorous test she had devised had pointed the same way, and the only thing standing against the entire weight of that evidence was her own conviction that she knew herself. And there, lying alone in the dark with her hands still remembering the warmth of his, she made herself examine that conviction the way she would examine anyone else's, coldly, and found the flaw in it. And the finding of the flaw was the worst moment of the whole affair. Worse than the first warm parchment, worse than the vault. I know myself. But she had been so certain of that, and the charm read precisely the part of a person their certainty could not reach. She had told 100 strangers as much. It reads, who you are, not who you have decided to be. She had said it kindly, and she had believed it about them, and she had never once considered that she might be a stranger to herself, that the most examined person she had ever met might have done all that examining with a torch she had aimed only at the rooms she was willing to see lit. there was one test she had not run. She saw it clearly in the dark, and she recoiled from it, and she saw why she had been avoiding it for 2 weeks without admitting she was avoiding anything. She had been testing the machine. 5 readings, a witnessed reciprocal, 6 centuries of precedent, all of it interrogating the apparatus, the ink, the sigils, the record. She had built the entire investigation to answer the question, is the working faulty? And she had done it that way. She understood now, lying rigid in the dark, precisely so that she would never have to answer the other question. The one that had no basin and no copper plate and no protocol in triplicate. The one she would have to answer alone, with no instrument but herself. Not is the magic wrong? Am I? She rebuilt the test from the ground up. She did not tell him. She told no one. She came in on a Sunday when the bureau was empty and the loneliness that had started all of this sat down beside her again like the old companion it was. And she stripped the working back to its founding principles and reconstructed it clean. New basin, new ink drawn fresh from the sealed reserve, every sigil reinscribed from the master text in her own hand while she checked each stroke against the diagram twice over. She built it as though she had never built it before, as though her own hands were suspect, as though the bias she had accused herself of in the small hours had contaminated every previous attempt. If there was a self-confirming loop in the apparatus, this would break it. If the earlier results had been a corrupted reading imprinting itself forward, this fresh working would return something else, anyone else, and she would have her fault at last, located and confirmed, and she could file it and go home and stop not sleeping. She wanted it to. She noticed, kneeling over the basin in the empty Sunday building, that she wanted it to return someone else, and she noticed further that the wanting had changed its shape since the first night. 2 weeks ago, she had wanted a different name because Malfoy was impossible. Now she wanted a different name because Malfoy had stopped being impossible. And the not impossible was more frightening than the impossible had ever been, because the impossible required nothing of her, and the not impossible required everything. She laid the fresh parchment flat. She spoke the old words. She set her hand upon it. The parchment warmed. It warmed differently. She would swear to that afterward, though she could never have proved it and would never try, that this time the warmth came faster and went deeper, that where the earlier readings had felt like a hand laid on the surface of her, this one felt like a hand closing around something at her center, gentle and absolute, the working reaching all the way down past every lit room she had aimed her torch at and into the dark ones behind them, the ones she had spent a lifetime keeping the doors shut on. She felt it find the loneliness. She felt it find the thing beneath the loneliness, the shape of an absence she had never let herself name, the exact contour of a person-shaped emptiness she had carried so long she had mistaken it for solitude. She felt it recognize that shape. The copper plate began to write. She did not close her eyes. She had closed her eyes for every reading before this one. She had watched his hand and his face, but never her own name arriving, had always looked away at the last, and she understood now that the looking away had been the whole of her cowardice distilled into a single reflex. So this time, she did not look away. This time she made herself watch the patient hand form the letters under her own motionless fingers. And she watched D, and she watched R, and she watched the whole of it, unhurried, certain, the same 3 words that had waited years for her to finally read them, and were, she understood at last, still waiting. Not for her to read them, she had read them a dozen times, but for her to believe them. Draco Lucius Malfoy. And this time, watching it with her eyes open and the working's warmth still closed gentle around her centre, she did not say no. The word did not even rise in her. She sat in the empty Sunday building with her hand on the warm parchment and her own truth written under it in a hand older than the ministry. And the thing she had been holding up brick by brick for 2 weeks simply came down, all at once, without a sound, the way a held breath comes down, and what was underneath it was not the collapse she had braced for. What was underneath it was quiet. What was underneath it was a person-shaped emptiness that had just been given, in copper plate, the name of the person shaped to fill it. She stayed very still for a long time. The Sunday light moved across the floor. When she could move again, she did not reach up to adjust a cuff or straighten a curl or do any of the small frantic things her hands did when the truth arrived unwelcome. Because this truth had not arrived unwelcome, and her hands, for once, had nothing to hide from. She should have felt lighter. She had expected, in the moments she had let herself imagine giving in, that giving in would feel like relief, the setting down of a weight. Instead, she felt something more like terror, and it took her a while, sitting there in the going light, to understand why, and when she understood it, she went cold in a way the warm parchment could not reach. The terror was not that the magic was right. The terror was that if the magic was right, then she had spent 2 weeks doing something to him. She had summoned him under statute. She had made him lay his hand on the parchment and let the working read him in front of her. She had interviewed him about the most defended places in himself and watched him set down his weapons one by one and answer her honestly, night after night, in a cold archive by candlelight. And she had done all of it under the banner of proving they didn't belong together. She had told him, in words, that the entire purpose of every hour they spent was to demonstrate that he was her mistake. And he had known. He had said it himself, "You want me to help you prove we don't belong together." And he had come anyway, Thursday and every night after, and warmed her frozen hands between his own, and let her leave when she bolted and said good night, Granger, as though his own name in the copper plate meant nothing. 7 weeks of silence, so as not to burden her. And then 2 more weeks of helping her try to prove herself right, that they were wrong. She stood up so fast the fresh basin rocked. She had to find him. Not tomorrow, not through the proper channels, not with a summons under statute. Now, tonight, before her nerve failed and she talked herself back into rigor. She had to find him and tell him that the investigation was over, that she had run the one test she'd been too afraid to run, and it had returned him a 6th time, and this time she had watched it write his name with her own eyes open, and that she was sorry, more sorry than she had words for making a man already so certain of his own unworthiness spend a fortnight assembling the evidence of his own rejection. The door of the working room opened. She turned, the apology already crowding up into her throat, and it was not him. It was the Bureau's night registrar, an elderly man with a lantern and a ledger, and a look of grave apology on his face. And he said her name, Miss Granger, in the careful tone people use when they are about to hand you something you did not ask for. And he told her that a formal query had been lodged against reference M-4471 not an hour ago, a request to have the match declared void and struck from the record on grounds of clerical error, and that the party who had lodged it, wishing the whole matter closed and forgotten with no further procedure and no further contact, was Mr. Draco Malfoy. She read the query 3 times before the words would hold still. The night registrar had left it with her. It was hers to process. Technically, reference M-4471 being her open variance, and he had set the single sheet on the table beside the fresh basin with an old man's discretion, and gone, taking his lantern, leaving her the working room's low blue light and a document written in a hand she did not recognize because it was not Draco's hand. It was a solicitor's, formal, retained, paid for. The undersigned requests that the above-referenced result be declared void ab initio on grounds of apparatus error, struck from all records, and that no further procedure, correspondence, or contact be initiated by the Bureau or its officers in connection therewith. No further contact. He had paid a solicitor to write no further contact into a legal instrument so that it could not be softened or reconsidered or reached around. He had built himself a wall of law between them, the way she had built her walls of procedure, and he had done it, she saw with a lurch on a Sunday, within the same few hours she had spent in this room watching the charm write his name a 6th time with her eyes open at last. She understood it. That was the unbearable part. She understood exactly what had happened, because it was the mirror of what she had done, and she, of all people, had no standing to fail to recognize it. He had spent 2 weeks helping a woman prove he was her error. He had warmed her hands in a freezing archive and been left standing at the top of a stair. He had answered every honest question she asked and watched her bolt from the one moment his face had let the truth through. And somewhere in these last days, he had reached the same edge she had reached and looked over it, and, being a man who had learned to keep his face from telling the truth, being a man who had read his own result alone so that no one could see him do it, he had decided to end the thing before it could end him, to have it struck from the record, to make it, retroactively, never true. If the match could be declared void ab initio from the beginning, then he had never been her answer at all, and a man who had never been anyone's answer could not be rejected as one. The kindest available arrangement. He had said that to her on the first day about his 7 weeks of silence. She had turned the phrase over and found no cruelty in it. She found the same absence of cruelty here in the solicitor's cold clauses, and it was worse than cruelty would have been, because cruelty she could have fought. She did not process the query. She left it on the table beside the basin, and she left the fresh parchment with his name still on it beside the query, the 2 documents side by side in the blue light, the working saying this is true, and the law saying let it be as though it never was. And she went to find him, because a solicitor's clause was a wall, and she had spent her whole life proving that walls came down if you were rigorous enough about the seam. She knew where he worked. He had told her in one of the interviews, without meaning to tell her anything, a conservation atelier off a narrow lane in a part of wizarding London she had walked past 100 times, a workshop where damaged texts came to be coaxed back to legibility by people patient enough to spend a day over a single page. It was past midnight. It would be shut. She went anyway, and the lane was wet with a rain that had come on while she was underground with the parchment, and the cobbles threw back the light of the one lit window she found at the end of it, and behind the glass, at a long table under a single warm lamp, bent over a scorched page with a fine brush in his hand, was Draco Malfoy, working at 1 a.m. on a Sunday, because he too was a person who did not sleep when the thing inside him would not let him. She stood in the rain and looked at him through the glass for a moment before she knocked. He did not know he was being watched, and so his face was not arranged. She had never once seen his face not arranged, she realized. Every version of it she possessed was a version he had composed for company. And what she saw, unguarded under the warm lamp, was not the closed grey stillness she had spent 2 weeks unable to read. What she saw was grief. Plain and quiet and enormous. The grief of a man doing careful work with his hands so that the rest of him would have something to do besides feel. And she understood that the solicitor's clause had not been a wall he'd built without cost. It had cost him this. It was costing him now, at this table, at this hour, in the set of his shoulders over the ruined page. She knocked. He went still. She watched him compose his face, watched it happen through the glass, the grief folding itself away, the stillness coming down like a shutter, before he even looked up. And when he did look up and saw her standing in the rain in the light of his one window, the composed face held for a second, and then, briefly, failed. Something crossed it. Then it was composed again, and he set down the brush with great care, the way a person sets down something they cannot afford to break. And he came to the door and opened it, and the warm, lamplit air of the workshop met the cold, wet air of the lane, and neither of them said anything. "It's the middle of the night," he said finally. His voice was level. The level was work. She knew that now, could hear the effort in it, could hear the wall going up brick by brick behind the words. "You shouldn't be here. There's a document specifically to the effect that you shouldn't be here." "I'm not here as an officer of the Bureau," she said. The rain was in her hair and running cold down the back of her collar, and she did not care. "The document says no contact from the Bureau or its officers. I'm not, right now, I'm not either of those things. Right now, I'm just standing in your street getting rained on." "Granger." He closed his eyes briefly. "Don't. Please. I have made this as easy as it can be made. Take the void, process it, and we can both—" a breath. "We can both go back to not knowing each other, which is, I promise you, the arrangement that costs you the least. You keep doing that." Her voice cracked and she let it. "You keep choosing the arrangement that costs me the least. 7 weeks of silence so I wouldn't be burdened. A solicitor so I wouldn't have to have an awkward conversation. You've spent this entire time managing my comfort at your own expense, and you haven't once, not once, asked me what I actually want. Because what you want, he said. And now the level was gone. Now something raw came up through it. Was made a matter of record 2 weeks ago, in your own words, when you summoned me under statute to help you prove I was your mistake. I've had it in writing, Granger. I didn't need to ask. You told me every night for a fortnight exactly what I was to you. His jaw worked. His hands, at his sides, had gone white at the knuckles. So, forgive me if I decided, for once in my life, to be the one who ends a thing before someone else can. It's the only dignity available to me, and I would like very much to keep it. The rain came down between them in the lamplight, and she stood in it, and everything she had come to say crowded up at once and would not order itself. And what came out, because it was true, because it was the truest thing she had, was not an argument. I ran it again tonight, she said. The reading. I rebuilt the whole working from scratch, new basin, new ink, every sigil in my own hand, because I was so sure the earlier readings were corrupted. I was so sure there was a fault. I built it clean so it would finally give me someone else. She was crying now, she realized distantly, or the rain had simply reached her eyes. She could not tell, and it did not matter. And I kept my eyes open this time. I always looked away before. Every single reading, I looked away at the last second, and I never let myself see the name arrive, because if I didn't see it arrive, I could keep telling myself it was the machine. So tonight, I kept my eyes open, and I watched it write your name, letter by letter, with my hand on the parchment. And Draco. His name. She had said his name. She had never once said his name, and she watched it land on him like a struck note. I didn't say no. The word didn't even come. It just wrote your name, and I sat there, and it was true. It was the truest thing I've ever read, and I have spent 2 weeks making you help me prove the opposite. And I am so sorry. I am so sorry for what I made you do. Stop, he said, but not the way he'd said don't. Lower, unsteady. He had come out from the doorway without seeming to decide to, out into the rain, bareheaded, the water darkening the pale hair against his skull. And the composed face was gone now, wholly gone, and what was underneath it in the lamplight was the same grief she had seen through the glass, except that it was breaking. It was coming apart, and he stood a foot from her in the wet with his whole undefended face turned up to the light and said, "Stop. You can't say that to me and not mean it, Granger. I have spent 7 weeks and 2 more not letting myself. If you don't mean it, if this is you being rigorous, if tomorrow you decide the fresh working had a fault too." It didn't have a fault. She had closed the distance without knowing she'd moved. They were near enough now that the rain fell on both of them from the same edge of lamplight, near enough that she had to tip her face up to his, near enough that his ragged breath was warm against the cold of her wet cheek. There was never a fault. The only fault in the entire working was me. I was the glitch. I was the thing that kept coming back wrong, because I couldn't. I wouldn't look at the one room I'd never let myself light, and the magic could see straight into it the whole time. It saw you in there. It's been trying to tell me since the first night, and I fought it for 2 weeks because I was too much of a coward to believe a thing I couldn't prove. Her hand came up. She watched it come up as though it belonged to someone braver than she was, and she laid it flat against the wet lapel of his coat, over the place where, under wool and rain and the ruin of his composure, she could feel his heart going hard and fast. I'm not being rigorous. I'm done being rigorous. I'm standing in your street in the rain telling you the magic was right and I was wrong. And I need you to believe me, because I don't think I can bear it if you've built a wall I can't get through. His hand came up over hers, pressing it against his chest, holding it there as though to check it was real. And the rain ran down both their faces, and the single lamp burned gold behind him. And for one long suspended moment, neither of them breathed, his forehead dropping slowly to rest against hers, the last inch of cold air between their mouths thinning to nothing as his other hand rose to cradle the side of her rain-wet face. He did not close the last inch. She felt him not do it, felt his forehead against hers, and his hand cradling her wet cheek, and his heart going hard under her palm. Felt him hold there, so close that his uneven breath moved against her mouth, and then felt him hold back, a tension coming into him that had nothing to do with desire, and everything to do with the discipline of a man who did not trust good things not to be taken from him. His thumb moved once against her cheekbone, learning it, and then went still, and he drew his forehead from hers, not far, an inch, but an inch that undid her. "No," he said. His voice was wrecked. "Not like this. Draco, listen to me." His hand did not leave her face. He kept her there, close, in the rain, as though letting go and refusing were two different things, and he could only manage one of them. "You came here at 1 in the morning, out of your mind, from a working that took you apart. You're soaked through. You're shaking. You've had a fortnight of no sleep. I can see it on you, Granger. You look like something the war left behind. And you've just felt the ground go out from under everything you were certain of 2 hours ago. If I kiss you now, I'll have kissed you in the middle of the worst night of a bad month, when you weren't yourself, and tomorrow you'll wake up and be rigorous again, and you'll wonder whether it was true, or whether it was just the state you were in. And I can't." His breath caught. "I can't be a thing you have to reconsider in the morning. I've been reconsidered enough for one lifetime. If you're going to choose me, I need you to choose me sober and slept and certain in daylight when nothing is falling apart. Not because the magic said so, not because you're undone, because you looked at me in the plain light of an ordinary day and chose it anyway." She understood then how badly she had wounded him without ever meaning to, and how carefully he was refusing to let her heal it with a gesture, and it made her love him. The word arrived, plain and enormous, and she did not flinch from it, more than the kiss would have. "All right," she whispered. "All right. Daylight, sober, certain." "All right," he said, and finally let his hand fall from her face and stepped back into the rain, and the cold rushed into the space where his warmth had been. He looked at her a moment longer, drinking it in the way a man drinks who does not believe there will be a next glass. "Go home, Hermione. Sleep. And if in the morning you still, then come and find me. I'll be here. I'm always here." A ghost of the old dryness cracked down the middle. "It's the only place I go." She went home, and for the first time in a fortnight, she slept. She woke to sun. It came through the Islington window at an angle she had not seen in weeks, because she had not been asleep to miss it, and it lay in a warm bar across the bed, and she lay in the warm bar of it and did the thing he had asked her to do, which was to be rigorous one last time, but rigorous now about the right question. Not is the magic faulty, not even am I the glitch. She had answered those. The question this morning, in the plain, ordinary light of a Monday, with the whole of the working behind her and none of the undoing of last night left in her blood, was the simplest and the largest. Knowing everything I know, choosing freely, wanting nothing to be true that isn't, do I want him? She lay in the sun and let the answer come, and it came without drama, without terror, without the person-shaped emptiness aching to be filled. It came as a plain, warm certainty, the kind she had spent her whole life trusting in every domain but this one. She wanted him. Not because 6 centuries of magic had paired them, not because a person-shaped absence had been given a name, because she had sat across a narrow table from him night after night and watched a man who had every reason to armour himself set down his weapons one at a time in front of the person least owed his honesty, and had answered her cruelest questions with a tired truthfulness she had no defence against. Because he had warmed her hands in a freezing archive and asked for nothing. Because he had built himself a wall of law out of grief and stood in the rain and refused to kiss her rather than let her wake up unsure. Because he described the smell of old parchment with the same 3 words she did. Because when she had said his name in the rain, she had watched it land on him like the first kind thing he'd been handed in years, and she wanted to be the one who handed him the rest of them. That was not the magic. That was her. The magic had only been right about it first. She got up. She washed and dressed with a care she noticed and did not interrogate. She ate, actually ate, for the first time in days. She did not go to the bureau. She left reference M-4471 on the table beside the basin where it belonged, the working and the void lying side by side, and she left them there because she was going to resolve the whole matter herself, in person, in daylight, in the plain, ordinary light of a Monday, exactly as he had asked. The lane was dry now. The rain had gone and taken the drama with it, and in the flat, undramatic morning light, the conservation atelier looked like what it was, a modest workshop with a good window, and through the window she could see him already at the long table, already bent over a page, and she understood that he had not slept the way she had slept. He had told her the truth. It was the only place he went. He had come here to work through the hours until he knew, one way or the other, whether she would come, and he was working through them still. And the set of his shoulders was the set of a man who did not let himself hope, because hope had a cost he had learned the price of. She opened the door. The bell above it rang, small and bright. He looked up. She watched him see her and watched him understand from her face, her rested, ordinary, certain morning face, nothing falling apart behind it, that she had come sober and slept and certain in daylight, exactly as he'd asked. And she watched the thing he did not let himself do finally happen despite him. She watched him, hope. It broke across the composed grey face like light through a shutter thrown suddenly open, and he stood up so fast the stool scraped, and then stopped, because he had used up all his boldness in the rain and had none left for the daylight, and he stood there behind his work table with a fine brush still in his hand and his whole face undefended, and asked her nothing, because he did not dare. "It's morning," she said. She was surprised by how steady her voice was. All the shaking of last night was gone. There was only this plain, warm certainty, and it held her voice level the way procedure used to. "I slept. I'm not undone. Nothing's falling apart. I ate breakfast." A small, helpless laugh got loose. "I ate a whole breakfast, Draco. I can't remember the last time I did that. And I sat in the sun, and I asked myself the only question that matters, which isn't whether the magic was right. It was, we've established that. It's been right for 600 years, and it was right about me. I was just too frightened to look. The question was whether I'd choose you anyway, in daylight, with nothing forcing it, knowing exactly who you were, and exactly who you are, and everything in between." She took a step toward the work table. "And I would. I do. I'm not here because a piece of parchment paired us. I'm here because I've spent 2 weeks trying to prove I don't belong with you. And the more thoroughly I proved it, the more I understood I'd got the whole thing backwards. And I'm here because you stood in the rain and refused to kiss me so that I could be sure. And no one has ever taken that kind of care with my certainty in my entire life. And I want—" Her voice did not break, but it went very soft. "I want to be the person who takes that kind of care with yours. Withdraw the void. Please, don't strike it from the record. It's the truest thing either of us has ever read." The brush had gone still in his hand. He set it down, carefully, the way he set everything down, the way he had set down the brush in the rain last night, as though the world were made of things that could be broken, and he had learned to handle all of them gently. And he came out from behind the work table into the plain morning light of the workshop, and he stopped an arm's length from her, and his composure was simply gone, had been gone since the doorbell rang, and he made no effort to rebuild it. "Say it again," he said, barely a voice at all. "The part with my name." "Draco," she said. He closed his eyes. She watched him take it. His name, said plainly in daylight by the one person the magic had spent 6 centuries waiting to pair him with, said not as an accusation or a summons or a matter of record, but as the simplest kind of claiming. And she watched 2 weeks of grief and 7 weeks of silence, and a lifetime of being someone's error and no one's answer, break open in him all at once, quietly, the way he did everything. And when he opened his eyes, they were wet, and he did not compose his face against it. "In daylight," he said, "sober, certain." "Certain," she said. And this time, when the last inch closed, it was he who closed it, one hand rising to her jaw and the other to the small of her back, drawing her in slow and sure with the whole undefended weight of a man who had finally decided to believe a good thing. And the morning sun lay warm across the two of them through the good window as his mouth found hers at last, and the small bright bell above the door was still faintly ringing. The kiss was not the ending. She learned that in the first hour of it, and in the days that followed, and it was the best lesson she had ever been slow to learn. For it turned out that a kiss, however long delayed, and however carefully earned, resolved nothing but the question of whether. It answered, "Do we?" and left every harder question standing. How and what will it cost? And what will the world make of this? And, hardest of all, the one that lived in the set of his shoulders when he thought she wasn't looking. How long before she comes to her senses? She had believed, in the sunlit workshop with his mouth finally on hers, that the wall had come down for good. She discovered over the following weeks that walls a lifetime in the building did not come down for good. They came down and were quietly rebuilt in the night and had to be taken apart again in the morning, patiently, brick by brick, and that the taking apart was the actual work, the work the kiss had only earned her the right to begin. There was the matter of the record, first, which she had thought would be simple and was not. She went to the bureau on the Monday afternoon, still warm from the workshop, and withdrew nothing, because she found she could not. Reference M-4471 was an open variance investigation that she herself had opened under statute, and the void query and her own 5 readings logged in the apparatus, and the whole paper trail of a fortnight spent trying to prove the Bureau's first false match. To simply file it all away as resolved would have been the easy thing, the quiet thing, the thing that let them slip out of the whole affair unremarked. But she was Hermione Granger, and she could not, in the end, let a lie sit in a record, even a lie in her own favour, even the kindest available arrangement, and so she did the harder thing. She wrote the truth. She documented in her own flat official hand that reference M-4471 was not a false match, that the apparatus had functioned correctly through 6 readings, and that the variance had originated not in the working, but in the investigating officer, who had been unable, for reasons she stated plainly, to accept a correct result. She signed it. She filed it where anyone with clearance could read it. "You didn't have to do that," Draco said, when she told him that evening in the workshop where she had begun, without either of them quite deciding it, to spend her evenings. He was at the long table with a scorched page, and she was in the chair by the window with a book she was not reading, and the single lamp threw its warm gold across the pair of them, the way the candles had thrown theirs across the archive table, a lifetime and 3 weeks ago. You could have closed it quietly. No one would have known. I would have known. She watched him work, the fine brush moving over the ruined page with a patience that undid her every time she watched it. This man who spent his days coaxing damaged things gently back to legibility, who had spent his evenings for 3 weeks doing something not unlike it to her. And I'm not going to build this on a filed-away lie, Draco. Even a small one. Even one that protects us. I've had enough of things I keep in vaults, so no one has to look at them. His hand paused over the page. He did not look up, but she saw the line of his shoulders change, saw the thing move through him that moved through him whenever she said this, and us as though they were established facts of the world and not experiments that might fail, and she had learned to recognize it now. It was not doubt of her, it was doubt of his own right to be wanted, the reflexive flinch of a man braced for a good thing to be reconsidered. She had learned, too, that the answer to it was not argument. Argument he could deflect. He was clever, he could out-reason her into a corner and talk himself back out of hope. The only thing that answered the flinch was constancy, the plain fact of her in the chair by the window, evening after evening, not reconsidering. So she did not argue. She got up and came to the long table and stood behind him and put her arms around him from behind and rested her chin on the top of his bent head while he worked. And after a moment, she felt the tension go out of his shoulders, felt him lean back a fraction into the fact of her, and neither of them said anything, and the brush resumed its slow, patient motion over the damaged page. And that was the answer, and it was better than any argument would have been. There was the matter of the world, second, and the world was not kind. It got out as she had feared from the first night it would get out. Not through the bureau, she had guarded that too well, but through the ordinary channels by which the wizarding world learned everything, a friend of a friend who had seen them in the lane, a whisper, a photograph, and then it was in the papers, exactly as she had dreaded. Granger and Malfoy, the headline that could not decide whether it was a scandal or a joke, the war heroine and the marked man, the impossibility of it laid out for public entertainment. There were the letters, some cruel to her and crueler to him. There were the people who had loved her through the war and could not understand it, who took her hands and asked her gently, terribly, whether she was quite sure, whether she remembered, whether she had forgotten what he had been. There was one afternoon at the Burrow, which she would not describe to him afterward, and which he did not ask her to, from which she came back to the workshop with her jaws set and her eyes bright and hard, and found him at the long table, pretending he had not been waiting to see whether she would come back at all. "They think I've lost my mind," she said from the doorway, "or that you've done something to it." He set down the brush. He did not compose his face. He had, over these weeks, been slowly unlearning the composing of his face, at least when it was only her, and what was in it now was the old braced grief, the certainty that this was the afternoon it ended, that the world had finally said the thing that would call her back to her senses. "And," he said, "have you lost your mind?" She crossed the workshop and took his face in both her hands, the way he had taken hers in the rain, and she made him look at her. "No," she said, "I've found it." It took the world's most ancient marriage charm, 6 readings, a freezing archive, a fortnight of not sleeping, and me nearly ruining the best thing that's ever happened to me out of sheer cowardice. But I have found it, and it is entirely made up at present, and, to my continuing astonishment, of you. Her thumbs moved on his cheekbones, the way his had moved on hers. So, the next time someone at the Burrow, or in the papers, or in my own head, asks me whether I'm sure, I'm going to have already answered it, here, with you, in the plain light of an ordinary day, as many times as it takes. I'm not going to spend my life defending this to people who weren't in the room. I was in the room. I ran the working. I know what I saw. Let them talk. She watched him try to disbelieve her and fail. It was the great slow project of these weeks, teaching him to fail at disbelieving her. And it was working, incrementally, the way conservation worked. A scorched page did not come back to legibility all at once. It came back one patient stroke at a time, and you had to sit with it, and you had to believe the ink was still there under the damage before you had any evidence that it was. "You're very certain," he said. It was almost a question. It was the same 3 words in a different order, the ones he had made her promise in the rain, and she understood he was giving them back to her now, testing whether they held from her side too. "Sober and slept and certain," she said. "Every day this week. Ask me again tomorrow. Ask me every day. I'll give you the same answer until you believe it, and then I'll keep giving it because it'll still be true." And there was, at the last, the matter of the 2 of them, which was the only matter that had ever really been at stake, and which the record and the world had only ever been distractions from. She had thought, going in, that the hard thing would be the impossibility of him, the history, the mark on his arm, the boy in the corridor, the war. And those were real, and they did not vanish. She did not pretend they had. But the actually hard thing, the thing that took the weeks and the patience and the arms around him at the work table, was something she had never anticipated, which was the depth of his conviction that he did not deserve to be anyone's answer. It lived under everything. It was the 7 weeks of silence and the solicitor's clause and the flinch when she said us. It was a lifetime of being told by a father whose lesson he had never wanted that a Malfoy was a certain kind of thing, and it did not simply lift because a woman loved him. It had to be worn down. It had to be answered day after day, not with the declarations, but with the plain fact of staying, with the chair by the window and the arms around his shoulders and the evening after evening of not being reconsidered, until the thing that had been burned into him began, slowly, under her patient constancy, to come back the other way, to relearn a truth it had never been allowed to hold, that he could be chosen in daylight, freely, and that the choosing would not be taken back. She did not know exactly when it turned. There was no single moment, no copper plate, no warm parchment. There was only the accumulation of ordinary evenings, until one night she looked up from her book to find him already looking at her across the lamplit workshop, not braced, not grieving, not waiting for the end, but simply looking, openly, the composed face nowhere in evidence, a man at rest in a good thing. He had finally decided to believe was his, and she understood that the last wall had come down and stayed down, and that she had not even noticed the moment it fell, because for once she had not been being rigorous. She had only been living in the plain warm light beside the person the magic had spent 600 years waiting to hand her. A year turned, the way years do, and the wizarding world found other scandals to be scandalized by, and Granger and Malfoy slid off the front pages and into the ordinary category of things that were simply true. A couple, unlikely, established, no longer news. The letters stopped. The friends who had taken her hands and asked whether she was sure came one by one and, in their own time, to a wary peace with it, because they saw her, and she was not a woman who had lost her mind. She was a woman who had, visibly, found something. The burrow softened last and softened least, but it softened because Molly Weasley could not indefinitely maintain a cold front against a man who arrived at every gathering with a rare restored book for her under his arm, and helped, without being asked, with the washing up. Hermione still worked at the bureau. She had thought, in the worst of it, that she might have to leave, that a compatibility charmwright, who had opened a variance investigation against her own result and then married. The result could not credibly go on matching strangers. But she found the opposite was true. She was better at it now. She had stopped telling the frightened ones the charm is never wrong in the tone of someone reciting a fact, and started telling them in the tone of someone who knew that the magic did not read who they had decided to be, and that sometimes the person it named was a person they would have to be brave enough to meet, including, sometimes, the version of themselves who could love that person. She had walked the road herself. She could walk them a little way down it now, and they trusted her because she did not pretend it was easy, and because when the result came back impossible, she did not flinch from the word. Reference M-4471 stayed in the record, unvoided. The truth she had written filed where anyone could read it. She had come to be glad of it. It sat in the vault among 6 centuries of immaculate matches, and it was the one match in all of them that carried, in the investigating officer's own flat hand, the full history of how nearly it had been thrown away, how the person the magic had chosen had spent a fortnight trying to prove the magic wrong, and had failed, and had, in failing, been saved. She thought sometimes that it was the most honest document in the entire bureau. Every other file recorded a result. Hers recorded the fight against it, and the losing, and why the losing had been the best thing that ever happened to her. He asked her on an ordinary evening, which was the only kind of evening she trusted anymore, both of them having learned to be suspicious of drama. They were in the workshop. It was raining, a soft, steady rain, nothing like the storm of the night she had stood in the lane and told him the truth, just the ordinary wet of an ordinary spring, running down the good window and blurring the lamplight of the lane beyond. She was in the chair by the window that had become her chair, and he was at the long table with a page, and the single lamp threw its warm gold across the pair of them, and she was not being rigorous about anything at all. She was only watching the rain and half watching him work and thinking about nothing, which she had learned was a thing a person could do and even enjoy. He set down the brush. She heard it, the small particular sound of him setting something down carefully. And she knew the sound so well by now that she looked up, because he only set the brush down that carefully when he was about to do something that mattered. He came around the long table into the lamplight, and he stood in front of her chair, and his face was not composed, had not been composed in her presence for the better part of a year, and what was in it now was not the old braced grief, and not the flinch, but something she had watched him grow into slowly over the ordinary evenings, a settledness, a man who had finally come to believe that a good thing could be his and would not be taken back. And under the settledness tonight, a nervousness so plain and so unguarded that she was on her feet before he had said a word. "I had a whole speech," he said. The nervousness cracked his voice, and he let it crack. He had unlearned by now the hiding of such things from her. "I wrote it out, I've restored 600-year-old manuscripts with a steadier hand than I wrote it with, and I've read it over a dozen times, and standing here, I find I can't remember a single line of it, which I suppose is what one gets for trying to script the one thing in my life I actually mean. He reached into his coat. His hand, she saw it, the long pale fingers, the signet she knew so well, was not steady. So, I'll say it plainly instead, which is the only thing you've ever wanted from me anyway. Hermione. Draco, she said, and watched her name and his name land on each other in the lamplit air, the way they had that first time in the rain, and she was crying already and did not care. A piece of magic older than the ministry paired us, he said, and you spent a fortnight trying to prove it wrong, and I spent 7 weeks and then a solicitor trying to spare you the burden of me. And between us, we very nearly threw away the only true thing either of us has ever been handed. And I've thought about that a great deal. How close we came, how much of it was fear, how easily it might have gone the other way. He opened his hand. There was a ring in it, an old ring, not a Malfoy heirloom. She could see that at a glance. It was too plain, too warm, chosen and not inherited. But the thing I keep coming back to is this. The magic named us. It didn't make us. It only pointed. Everything after. You in the rain and the daylight and the chair by that window every evening for a year. And the arms around my shoulders when I couldn't believe I was allowed to be wanted. None of that was the charm. That was you. You chose it, freely, in the plain light of ordinary days, more times than I could count, until even I believed it. So I'm not asking you, because 6 centuries of magic said we belonged together. His voice steadied, at the last, into the plainest and surest she had ever heard it. I'm asking, because I looked at you across an ordinary room on an ordinary rainy evening, with nothing forcing my hand and nothing falling apart, and I chose it too. Marry me. Not because the working matched us, because I'd match us. Because if the parchment had never warmed at all, I'd still be standing here. She did not make him wait. She had made him wait once, in a freezing archive and a fortnight of cowardice, and she had learned what it cost him, and she would never make him wait for anything again. Yes, she said, and then, because once was not enough for a man who had spent his life braced for good things to be reconsidered. Yes, in daylight, sober, certain, every day for the rest of my life, and I'll say it again every morning until you stop expecting me to take it back, and then I'll keep saying it because it'll still be true. She took his unsteady hand in both of hers and steadied it. Yes, Draco, I'd match us too. I did match us. The magic only got there first. He slid the plain warm ring onto her finger, and his hands were shaking, and hers were not. And the rain ran soft down the good window, and the lamp threw its gold across the two of them, and he drew her in the way he had learned to draw her in over a year of ordinary evenings, slow and sure and unafraid now, a man at rest in a thing he had finally decided to keep, and kissed her, and it was nothing like the desperate hunger of the storm in the lane, and everything like the settled certainty of a chosen life, and neither of them was being rigorous about anything at all. Somewhere across the city, in a cold vault among 6 centuries of immaculate record, reference M-4471 sat sealed and true, the one match in all of them that carried the full history of how nearly it was thrown away, and how, in the end, it was not the magic that saved it, but 2 people brave enough to choose what the magic had only been wise enough to see. The rain eased. The lamp burned on. And in the warm gold light of the workshop, where damaged things were patiently made whole, Hermione Granger rested her head against the chest of the man the ancient charm had named, and she had chosen, and listened to his heart go steady and unhurried beneath her ear, no longer braced for anything, at last simply at home, and understood, with the plain quiet certainty that had replaced all her rigour, that some truths cannot be proved, only believed, and then, patiently, over a lifetime of ordinary days, lived all the way into.
So that's the end of their story. Thank you for staying with me. I want to tell you something about why I wrote this one. When I write, I like to ask a simple question. What if we don't really know ourselves? We think we do. Hermione thought she did. She was the smartest person in every room, but she was afraid to look at one small part of her own heart, and the magic saw it before she did. There is a moment I keep thinking about. She runs the test again, late at night, alone. And this time she keeps her eyes open. She watches his name appear, letter by letter, and she does not say no. That was the whole story for me, in one small moment. Not a big kiss, just a woman finally being brave enough to look. That is the lesson I wanted to leave with you. Some truths you cannot prove, you can only choose and believe them, and then you live them slowly, one ordinary day at a time. We spend so much energy trying to be right. Sometimes it is better to be honest instead. Thank you for listening. Take care of your own heart and don't be afraid to look inside the rooms you keep dark. I'll see you in the next story.